This is utopian visions of a dysfunctional society. So we're now actually looking at the last two revolutions of the 19th century, and I want to sort of link the whole thing up. Now, you're all familiar with Renoir's painting of the boatman's lunch, taken at La Fournaise. In fact, I think some of you have been there with me, sitting exactly at that place. The old Fournaise homestead has been renovated, and you can actually have lunch here. Now, it is very much a vision, or an impressionist vision of the golden age, of a kind of utopia, of a kind of heaven, as Renoir in particular imagines it. And of all of the impressionists, as we'll see as we go through this lecture, they deliberately eliminate the difficult parts of life, whether it's social issues, gender issues, any of these things are not painted. The impressionist paintings basically are always of a bright sunny day. Now, we have what looks like an extraordinary harmonious society, and we're just going to look at who there is in this. Over here we have the painter Caillebotte. Some of you will have been to lectures here. Caillebotte was one of the younger members of the Impressionist group. He came from a wealthy family, and he is the person who is actually going to bankroll some of the 8 exhibitions. He organises it for them, and he will collect the paintings of the other members of the group when they are absolutely destitute. And in fact, he will pay for Monet's studio in the Rue de Ventimille to keep him going when he's living outside of Paris. So he's sitting here, so you have the painters. Over here you have another one of Renoir's friends, who's an Italian Maggiolo, who is a sort of witty raconteur with one of the Parisian newspapers. Here, I'm just going through the men. Here you have Alphonse, who is the son of the owners, Alphonse Fournaise. In other words, he represents, I suppose, this idea of sport, you know, of which the middle classes were discovering, this idea of health, you know, a healthy mind and a healthy body, and which is actually going to be one of the themes of today's lecture. So, of course, what connects him very much with Caillebotte, and physically you can see this with the singlet, is that Caillebotte was also a great yachting and boating enthusiast, and in fact designed his own boats. Back here you have 2 more of Renoir's friends, Lestrange and L'Hôte, one of whom is a musician, another one who is an artist. Here he is here. And over here we have 2 different figures. This one is Charles Ephrussi, right, who comes from the great Ephrussi banking company, who will be the director of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. So, and he's talking to Jules Laforgue, who is his secretary and quite possibly his part-time lover. They sort of said Charles Ephrussi was entre deux chaises, between two chairs, and he actually is a poet. Now, this person here is quite interesting. He is the Baron, Le Maire, who actually was the mayor of Sagona, a war hero, and someone who is very interested in racing. Then we turn to the women. We have here the sister of Alphonse, Alphonsine, who is a pretty girl engaging this fellow here. She's actually a war widow. Her husband was killed during the Franco-Prussian War. Now, these other women whom you see here are all actresses. This is Angèle, who sort of posed as a model at some stage for all of these painters, Renoir and Caillebotte. We have Alain André, who you will see as the person who is the absinthe drinker in that, and she actually is a part-time model and also works in the chorus of the Folies Bergère. And Angèle, and over here we have Jeanne Samoury, who is quite a well-known actress. Now, what is interesting here is the person who is foregrounded is Aline Charigot, who of course is a seamstress and who will become Renoir's long-suffering wife. Now, it could be considered that this is a portrait of the women who, you know, Renoir had his way with, or you could see it in a more charitable way, looking at a very, very interesting modern society, a harmony of people who are grand bourgeois and collectors, those who are poets, those who are journalists, those who are painters, and those who are actresses. And the actresses, to some degree, were sort of on the edge of the prostitution limit. They were sort of more respectable than courtesans because they had that artistic edge. So this is this sort of racy society. Indeed, it is the painting of modern life. Everything is the way in which it should be in Renoir's world. Women are basically performing for men, as you can see. She's there with her little dog. They know their place. They are completely in triangles relating to men. You'll see in which his chest comes down here and she is in that triangle. Here you have another triangle with a man leaning over her and another one leaning in. Here is a woman again being attended by two men, and there's another triangle where a woman is interlocking eyes with this man here. So women really know their place. It's as a sort of secondary sort of gender grouping for people. So we have now then this what looks like everyone having a fantastic time. Where are they? They're out in nature. They're not in the city, are they? Because by now the city has become to be identified with vice, with corruption, with anxiety, as we will see when we're talking about Baudelaire. What they're drinking here is very important, and we'll talk about that. They're drinking wine. Wine with the emphasis on the grapes, this idea, wine, the natural drink of the French. You know, Charlemagne was supposed to have dribbled it on his son's lips when he was christened. Nothing like absinthe. Absinthe, which of course is manufactured in the city, manufactured by the Jews, you know, the big companies, and as we'll see, we'll look at how absinthe is vilified towards the end of the century. So all of these things in this painting elide difficulty. It's hard to believe that in the next year after this painting was taken, the French president would be shot at and would eventually die. This is Léon Gambetta from lead poisoning from the bullet by an anarchist, right? It's hard also to believe that in a couple of years Renoir will be vilifying this great collector, Charles Ephrussi, who has collected some of his paintings, and he will talk about, oh, it's Jew taste. This, of course, will be the beginning of the rising of the crescendo of anti-Semitism that you will see in the Dreyfus case of 1894. But also what is interesting is that it's hard to believe that just down the stream in Clichy there are these horrendous working class areas, mud and gasometers. It's also very hard to believe that a couple of miles from Chateau, and those of us who've been with me will remember that you have the burnt out hulk of the Chateau de Saint-Cloud, this magnificent castle, which was the hunting lodge of Louis XIV, 15th, 18th and Charles X, which was looking like this, and which Renoir had to basically pass to arrive at this place of idyllic happiness. So why is this happening? Why do we get this emphasis on a clear sunny day when clearly things were going wrong in society? Well, we really need to look back, and what I'm going to do today, to that revolution that we started to look at the end of the last lecture, the revolution of 1848, and the revenge against that revolution's outcome, which takes place in 1871, which we'll be talking about today. So basically, in these lectures, I'm really looking at two things. The first thing is this concept of individuality, which evolves over the 19th century, but also the way in which the revolutions arrive, and they are always unfinished business, right up until the First World War. And so we're going to be looking at that. Now, it is a very, very tumultuous century, as you can see. You start off with the Revolution of 1789, and then you have the First Republic, which comes after that very briefly. Napoleon I takes over as emperor. He goes into exile. Then you have the Bourbon kings brought back. Remember, the brothers of Louis XVI. Then they are removed, or he is removed, with the Revolution of 1830. Do you remember that? All right. Then we have the citizen king, Louis-Philippe, the cousin of the Orléans family. He is ousted in 1848, where we're going to start looking at it today. And for a very short time, you have the Second Republic, and the president of that Second Republic will be Louis Napoleon, who 3 years later will crown himself as emperor. He disappears at the Franco-Prussian War, and the Third Republic is declared. And during that time, in about 6 months later, you have this bloody uprising in Paris, which is the Commune, during which something like 30,000 to 50,000, I think, people die in the streets of Paris, or are deported or are executed. At the end of that, you then get the resuming of the Third Republic, which goes up until 1840. Right, we are now in the Fifth Republic. All right, now Rome, I want to go back to a painting which could not be more different from the one that we have just seen. We have a grouping of people, and I want you to keep in your mind also the liberty leading the people. Remember in 1830, that visionary one of a strong woman striding over the barricades, and we're going to see her again in a different mode in the Commune. What do we have here in about when we're just about to go into the revolution of 1848? You have a salon painting, of course, a painting which refers to the past, refers to the Greece and Rome, painting which is supposed to be moralizing and to tell a story. This is what salon art was all about. Impressionist art, as you know, of course, was about the everyday. There was no moral in it. And what you have here, you have an orgy, and this here you have this woman in the centre who's totally supine and passed out. She could not be more different from that painting of the woman of 1830. Here you have this orgy of people who are completely drunk. This fellow's so drunk he's trying to give to drink to the statues. You know, people are dancing, people have passed out. And all of this central activity or lack of activity, debauchery, is being witnessed by two people here who are foreigners and who link us into the painting. And this poet also, who is sitting here with a look of melancholy, looking out at the audience. Now, this wasn't just talking about the problems of ancient Rome, which was about to fall because of its own debauchery. This was the attitude in the 19th century, that this was, you know, was vice that killed the Roman Empire, not political problems and problems with the army. And what Couture is actually saying is that this is France, actually, in 1847. All right, it is corrupt, it is lost its energy, and in fact, remember, this is the time of the heyday of Romanticism. Remember, all of the great sort of writers and creative people hated this time of Louis Philippe from 1830 to 1848, and to turn to this romantic exaltation of the self that we looked at last week. So underneath the painting there was a thing saying plus cruel que la guerre, more cruel than than war. Vice had finally come over Rome and had taken revenge on or been the source of revenge for all of the countries that Rome had conquered. So this then was an image of what was wrong with society in 1830. As you know, Louis Philippe goes into exile, he's overturned, and the first of two revolutions in 1848 takes place. I'm just going to literally put you in this context. I think one thing is very important to remember, that when you sort of have an overview of history, you sort of look at history, you know, the great revolutions, but in between there are smaller revolutions that fuel the final one that takes off. And this is a perfect example of this, is in 1848. All right, Louis Philippe goes off into exile, and a poet, one of the great romantic poets, Lamartine, takes over as provisionary sort of president. And this is what's so interesting about the romantic movement, is that most of the great romantic writers were heavily involved in politics. So all of this business of, you know, fainting with love and ecstasy and melancholy really was just simply a literary front. I mean, look at Victor Hugo. He was a great socialist as well. So Lamartine actually is the person who is running the country for about 3 months. And he tries to rectify the problems of France, because the great problems are people want the vote. He gives universal suffrage to all men. Women won't get universal suffrage until 1945. And the second thing is employment. There is not employment in Paris. And Paris wants its own government. And you do have to remember also that there's always this big sort of gulf between Paris and France, Paris and the provinces. The provinces are very suspicious of Paris. And in fact, all of the big cities in the provinces have their own Lord Mayor, whereas Paris was not allowed to have its own Lord Mayor until you actually had Jacques Chirac, who becomes a Lord Mayor, because it was considered too powerful a post, that Paris was too dangerous. So anyhow, Lamartine comes in and starts up the national workshops, which gives employment to the unemployed in Paris. And people start flocking to Paris to come to these workshops and get a kind of dole, you know, more or less work for scratching your head. And this is subsidised by the rural areas, and they stop paying their taxes, and so all of this falls in a heap. Look, this is just a very general overview. And so you get the second uprising, which will bring in to power Louis Napoleon. All right, so the second revolution of 1848 opens up the way for the Second Republic. And there are elections, and the poet Lamartine stands against this unknown. Louis Napoleon had been in exile all his life, but he came back to power on the charisma of the name Bonaparte, and of course because of the rural areas who had had it with Paris and wanted someone who they thought would protect their interests. Really quite ironic when you see what will happen. So this is Louis Napoleon, who will 3 years later, in a coup d'etat, become the Emperor Napoleon III. All right, he's not Napoleon II in reference to his Napoleon II, who died in exile, the son of Napoleon I. Now, he's considered quite possibly not to be a Bonaparte at all. His mother had a sort of a fling with a fellow called the Duc de Morny, who was actually also the illegitimate son of Talleyrand. It's also very, very incestuous. All right, now, what I want to look at very briefly is, I'm not going to talk about the history of the place. What I really want to look about is what are the main themes, the main changes that take place in society, and what it is the rise of science at the time of this Industrial Revolution, and the way in which the scientific viewpoint informs every way of looking at every aspect of society. And I'm going to in particular look at the idea of disease, which is one of the prominent sort of ways in which everything from architecture to city planning to clothing to women is seen. Anyhow, I just wanted to very briefly look at the first thing, which is very different with under Napoleon II, who is going to reconstruct Paris, is the rise of technology, right? You get first of all, obviously, you get the new rise of glass, and you get steel and iron work, which means you can get buildings soaring up into space, which of course gives you light and airiness, which we will see is very important for germ theory, but of course it's something which is celebrated by the Impressionists. So what is very important to remember, that you don't get an art movement sort of completely out of sync with the major thought processes and discoveries of the time. And my theory is that basically it is medical ideas which push everything in society, and the art eventually is a reference to that. So you get, that's the first thing. The second thing is that with trains, you get for the first time a new sense of identity. Trains now start going to all areas of France. It would have taken you days to get from Marseille up into Paris, and now it's not nearly as long as that. It's not as arduous. In fact, people would be more, would have heard more about the Mohicans through the writings of Chateaubriand than they have from the people of Marseille. So now there's this sense of us as the French and no longer us as Parisians and us as Marseillais. I mean, that does continue, but there is the beginning of this idea of national identity. There's also, with the idea of the train journey, you get what will happen with art is this fragmentation of vision. Right, with things that start going extremely fast. Nothing is static any longer. You no longer have something which is in a central part of the canvas with beautiful vanishing points, because when you're in a train, things that are up close look very different from things that are at a distance. You're actually getting two kinds of perspectives. And so, of course, this instant brush stroke and the change of light, all of this relates very much to developments in technology. But also the idea of time itself changes. Now, up until the 19th century, or during medieval time, time was governed by the church. This idea of time as cyclical, it's all to do with the sort of magic of heavens and events. It's all, the universe is one. But what starts with the idea of time here is the time that starts with a railway journey and finishes, the time that the stock market has time to mature. And by the time you get to the Third Republic, you are in a completely secular time frame, which is very important. The calculation of time is important. Time up until then really wasn't particularly. Now you also get, and again we're going to look at this idea of the self, the rise of the bourgeoisie, but the rise of two types of bourgeoisie, right? This is the petit bourgeoisie, not the great Rothschilds, not the great bankers, not the great industrial owners, but these are the shopkeepers, the people who have made it through the hard yards, people who now are struggling to better themselves, right? Now you've got this idea of Darwinism, which has developed, with the survival of the fittest, the idea of struggle, the idea of energy being much more important than where you were born or who you are. Who you are, to some degree, relates to what you make yourself, which is almost a Protestant work ethic, which of course is being developed at the end of the century by Weber. So you get intense struggle amongst this bourgeoisie, and this will lead to, as we saw, the development of consumerism. Remember, we saw that the idea of the self had moved from the inner conflict of the romantics to the outside. You change your view of yourself by changing your exterior. This is why all of the buildings in Paris are going to be like a prop to this bourgeoisie who are going to appear like on the stage of a theatre, because what you are is what you appear. Appearing is everything. Being is not important, it's appearing. And so the great shops, of course, are going to push this forward, and you're going to get the development of fashion. Right? It's no longer something, fashion changes quickly because it makes people buy things, and people are constantly running after an identity. And you get the development of advertising, which starts at this time with the development of chromolithography, which means that you can print in colour. And for the first, you now get stars advertising powder. This is poudre de riz, which is advertised by Sarah Bernhardt. Now this is the same sort of thing you get now. These perfumes, Lolita perfume, or I can't even think of them, but all these people who actually mark, once they become famous for doing nothing, but for being famous, they then market, and you can be like them because you can buy things, all right? So your identity relates to your buying power. So all of this develops in the 19th century, particularly under the Second Empire. And also what we're going to get, the development of literature also propelled by scientific ideas, and we're going to look at that in a moment. Literature is no longer, like under Rousseau, inspired by philosophical ideas about, what is the good man, what is education all about. It takes scientific method to investigate actual facts and uses medical concepts to actually create characters, and that's quite fascinating, and we'll investigate all of these areas of pathology in the society. Drink, insanity, crime, prostitution, all of these will be examined by the great realist writers. And of course in art, art now is dominated by science as well. You've begun to look at how people see, what are the physics and the biological aspects of vision. How do we see colour? Chemists have been working on the breakup of colour in the wheel of the Chevreul wheel, and we now get this idea of time as being the fourth dimension which enters into painting. Right? You can no longer be a painter of modern life and paint a static view, because it is all changing constantly as you see it. The universe is full of energy. Atoms and molecules are whizzing round, as indeed are the bourgeoisie. So I want to now then examine the Paris of the Second Empire, and I want to examine it from the point of view of science and illness. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte spent all his life in exile, particularly in Germany. Which meant, rather than being someone who should be ridiculed, it means that he was the first sovereign leader of France who was trilingual or could speak 4 languages. He could speak fluent German, English. Of course, he spoke French, but he also spoke Italian as well. He'd been involved in some of the socialist movements in the unification of Italy, which is quite interesting. He's been ridiculed up until now. It's very interesting the way in which history or historical studies change, and he's now undergoing a huge amount of research and critical interest in him, no longer seen as a shifty little guy with a moustache, but someone who actually managed to survive about 21 years and in power at a very difficult time. Now, what else was I going to say about him? Now, he has come from London, and London in the 1830s has the great stink, I think, is in 1856, isn't it, when the people just cannot exist because of the smell. But London was a putrefying place because of the cesspools that all went into the Thames and so on, and he'd lived there. And there is a great movement at this time called the hygienist movement. And he would have absorbed this very much when he was in exile in London, and he comes to Paris wanting to make Paris a kind of London with the green spaces, but better. Now, he also inherits from his uncle this respect for the medical profession. Now, I don't know if did any of you come to my lectures at the Gallery on Napoleon? Right, well, I did that, yes, I remember you were there, that lecture on doctors, the importance that doctors, for Napoleon, who actually paints portraits of them. So there's this respect then. Now, what we have when Napoleon II comes to power, he has long time ruminated about what the problems are. There's the problems, he doesn't want to go back into exile, and he's figured out that there's the problem of Paris itself. And we'll talk about that, but I usually talk about the political dimension of this. This time we're going to be talking about the disease dimension. Now, in 1830 and again in about 1836, there are massive waves of cholera that come down over Paris. This is the cholera epidemic, which seems to go through the working class quarters, and in fact the Mortellerie, which is near the Tour Saint-Jacques. I don't know if you know, in the Rue de Rivoli. Do you know that, with that wonderful tower that's still there? This is all that's remains of Saint-Jacques, which was a powerful guild of the butchers, and of course that was a very dirty part of Paris, because this is where the carcasses went into the Seine, and so this is where you get water. Cholera is carried, of course, by water, and an incredible number of that people in that particular part of Paris died. And of course, the working class think it's a plot. The bourgeoisie are poisoning the wells and killing them off, and the bourgeoisie think this just proves that the working class are filthy, dangerous, and just not good to have around. And also, the prevalent idea of the time was the idea of miasmas. Right now, germ theory hadn't been developed, and even though Laennec, for example, I think it's in about the 1830s, finds a link between the cholera epidemic and water, people won't take any notice of him until much, much later in the century. It's considered that disease is carried by smells. Now, in fact, they were on the right track. Where you get stagnant water and dreadful rotting smells, you do then get disease as well. But the idea was it was this miasma that actually carries the disease. And if you think of malaria, that is malaria, bad air. That's where we get this idea from, right? And of course in Rome you were supposed to always move out in the hot season because you would get malaria because of the bad aeration. So this, of course, is Napoleon III then is going to open up the city. This is what it looked like before, with absolutely, you can imagine, all of the bodies. This is the Hôtel Dieu here, with the excrement and the dead bodies thrown into the river. The people who worked as butchers were working around here, and the pump that people used to pump water from the Seine is actually over here, and it was downstream. It was over there. So downstream from the Hôtel Dieu. So in other words, you pumped up all of the effluent as well. Of course, the effluent went right into the streets. Now, you see, this is, again, one of Marville's photos of part of Paris that was going to be destroyed. Napoleon III was very, very systematic about things. When he got his Baron Haussmann, who was a Protestant, who knew would be loyal to him because he was an outsider. He got Haussmann to draw up the plans for this reconstruction of Paris. But before these streets were demolished, these dirty little streets that, there's no air, where the sewers were sort of dribbling into the middle of the street, he got this photographer Marville, to go around and photograph every street that was to be demolished. So there is you can reconstruct perfectly the city before Haussmann. It's fascinating, actually. I've got the book upstairs. Anyway, so there you can see this is where everything was drained in the middle of the street, whether it's excrement or just normal, garbage. It all went through the centre. Of course, it stayed there, went into the wells, and so the wells themselves were contaminated. Now, what Napoleon III is going to do is get rid of all of these medieval huddle and at the same time get rid of the working class who are disease-ridden, all right? So that was this idea, get rid of disease, you get rid of the, put in sewers, open the place up, but get rid of the carriers of disease who are the working class. And so you get this extraordinary system. I mean, usually when we look at this, we look at it as a system for deploying troops, because of course Napoleon III wanted to make sure it was a safe city. At every one of these round points, he would have a caserne, have a barracks, so that as soon as there was a slightest hint of an uprising, out would come the soldiers. But you can also see it almost like a fan, all right, where the air comes in and the air goes out, this circulation of air, which will get rid of this disease of miasmas. Now, this was a city then in great change, and you get the great poet Charles Baudelaire in his poem Lucine, Paris change, rien m'a changé dans ma mélancolie n'a bougé. Right, Paris is changing, but nothing in my melancholy has changed. Now, all right, new buildings, scaffolding, blocks of stone, old suburbs, everything for me becomes an allegory, and my dearest memories are heavier than those rocks. Now, interesting that he talks about melancholy. Now, melancholy, of course, was something which up until the 19th century, or even in the 19th century, was something which was very prestigious in many ways. And remember, with insanity, you start out under the Greeks and Romans, someone who was depressed, usually was an intellectual, was born under the sign of Saturn, all right, and gradually you get then people who were mentally ill under the time of the church. They were often considered as saints, they were people who would hear voices. Look, I don't want to go against anyone's religious belief, but I mean, part of schizophrenia is of course hearing voices, and you can identify them in any way that you like. So you get then the church takes over mental illness, and by the time you get to the period we're looking at now, it'll be taken over by the medical profession, and you get the medicalised visions. So it's a very interesting grouping. But he is still sticking to this idea of melancholy and genius. So what do we get? And I just want to show you examples of inner and outer, just very quickly, because this is going to be the basis, this change that takes place after the 1840 revolution under Napoleon III is going to be the great catalyst for the revenge of the working class in 1871. Right? It's very important. So what do you get? You get these open streets where air can get through, all right, where there's movement. And the idea of modernity was movement, change, but also anxiety that went with it, right, which you get with Charles Baudelaire. All right, so we have light, air, movement. You notice the way in which everything is going somewhere, all right? It is not static. Now, if you look at that, it's the inner boulevards inhabited by the self-actualizing bourgeoisie. What do you get on the outskirts? This is the suburbs, which will be incorporated into Paris at the same time. Paris expands and is doubled. It takes in Montmartre and all of the villages. But this is where the working class are pushed out. You couldn't get a greater difference in style. So that's the inner boulevards and the outer. Who dominates these? On the inner boulevards, we have this elegant flaneur who literally dominates the boulevards. He's leaning on his balcony, looking out. His vision takes in all of this. And this is Boulevard Haussmann. If you actually, he lives on the corner of Miromeni, and he's looking down to Boulevard Haussmann. This is what is happening on the outskirts of Paris. There's no vanishing point, there's no balconies, there's no flaneur. The person who's walking is the rag picker, the old man who descends on Paris at night when the lights go out. But unfortunately under Haussmann the lights never go out now. We've got gas lighting, and so he's pushed further and further out. They pick up bits of hair, and remember I told you the hair would be used to make wigs and so on. What else do we have? We have eating in the inner boulevards, this idea of elegance, the respectability of the middle classes. Here you have the decadence of the drinkers and the eaters on the outskirts. What do you have in the way of monuments in the centre of the city? Well, you no longer have Notre Dame and so on, or at least, sorry, the technology. You actually have these magnificent buildings which are where we get the artistic side, which is foregrounded by Caillebotte. What you get on the outskirts, you get these sort of muddy factories. Here you have the great monuments to leisure. On the outskirts, you get the monuments to technology, well, not even technology, but to the workers who are going to be ground down working in factories. And entertainment, soirees, flirting, extraordinary dresses, clothes, tinkling of crystal chandeliers, whereas on the outskirts you're going to get Toulouse-Lautrec, and again this decadence, this bohemian sort of up-you sort of attitude. But in fact the only time that you will get a mingling of the bourgeoisie and the working class will be when the bourgeoisie slum it and go up onto the banks, up to Montmartre, to actually experience this. Now, this disease idea continues very much through, I think I mentioned this last week, the construction of the Haussmannian buildings. Now, I've got this because I thought it sort of highlighted certain things. This is a typical Haussmannian building. About every street, on the main streets had to be the same. In the side streets you could be different. In fact, most people did. Around the Plaine Monceau you get these extraordinary neo-Gothic houses and so on. But if you were on the main boulevard, you had to have this sense of perspective. So all of the buildings had to look the same. Why perspective? Because it gives you the sense of order. The city is dominated. It's this sort of the same idea that you actually had in prisons, which were developing at the time. Like Pentridge Prison was a 19th century prison. We have a central point where people can surveil what is going on. This idea of vision was extraordinarily important. Everything can be seen. All right. So Paris has to have all of these buildings which are the same, and there are always two balconies, one on the second floor, the ground floor, first floor, second floor, and one on the fifth floor. And up here you have the little chambre de bonne where the maids used to stay. Now what I wanted to show is what these Haussmannian blocks looked like and how it exemplifies this idea of worry about disease. Now the city has already got rid of some of the problems, all right? It's put in avenues to get air. It's put in drains, so you no longer have, effluent flowing in the streets. It's put in parks so that you get trees with air, all right? It's very much like a human body. But you've also at the same stage got rid of the working classes, all right? Because they are dirty, this means that they're morally dirty as well. And you want to keep them as far away as possible, but it's not possible because you have to have servants, oh ho hum, all right, because you don't actually have dishwashers or anything, you have to have one on two legs. And so this came back to a question that someone asked me the other day, this idea about women being pure and fainting and all of this. This is only for middle class women. The fainting fits and the migraines had to be looked after by a whole herd of working class little minions. So you've got to have servants. So how do you get rid of, make sure that there isn't any problem with them? So with these magnificent Haussmannian buildings, they completely changed in architecture. Instead of having a communal staircase where everyone in a building where sometimes you'd have different families on different levels, and have one staircase. So people would pass each other on the stairs. With the Haussmannian building, even if the whole family didn't own it, and you had different people owning different levels, their servants would always come in from a back staircase, and they would live around these back areas. So all of the living areas of the bourgeoisie would be here, and they were instructed to always have lights and chandeliers on so that they shine out onto the boulevard, and this is where you get this idea of the city of light. It didn't matter what happened at the back, and the servants came in separately and stayed separate. And the worry about the working class was such that, for example, people loved little dogs at this stage, and there was one woman who was really worried about, didn't want the servants to touch her dog because she thought they might give the dog fleas. So they ate the food that they produced, but it was only, the cook was very, very heavily under surveillance. Right, now I want to look at literature and how that really takes on this disease theory, and how this, the great question of the late 19th century is hygiene and moral hygiene as well. And you get the great writer Émile Zola, who comes from the South, starts out as a journalist, then becomes an art critic, but starts out to write the first time a series of books called the Rougon Macquart. And as some of you know, this happens to be my hobby horse. It is a series of books built on one family. And what is of interest is that he uses medical theory in two ways. Firstly, he's inspired by a doctor, Claude Bernhardt, who sets out this experimental way of looking at things, that you observe, you write down, you put different things together as in an experiment, and then the writer steps back and lets his characters take off. So there's this minute observation. It's not interest in philosophical theories or romantic passions. So you were removed from the mind in many ways, from philosophy. You're removed from the emotions of the romanticism, and you are now into strict scientific observation. So that's his methodology. But what he works on are two new ideas that have come up in medicine, and one of them is heredity. And he looks through heredity, how it works with environment. So really, in many ways, he's foreshadowing sociology in his novels. And he looks at, in particular, insanity and how it relates to alcoholism and criminality and prostitution. And these were the great issues of the 19th century. And he does this in a very convincing way. And those of you who haven't read any Zola, I think you should immediately go out and buy some of them. He starts out with a family with one ancestor, Adelaide Falk, who dies mad. All right, I think she's probably a paranoid schizophrenic. On her first marriage, she married a wily, rather unlikable, but rather relatively stable peasant. And so what Zola does, he traces through 1, 2, 3, 4 generations this idea of heredity, and how, according to environment, heredity can be modified more or less. However, in many ways, he's extremely pessimistic, and he feels that heredity is everything, which is quite interesting. And the people on this side, who descend from the wily peasant, end up as unscrupulous people, but they succeed in society. You get this Aristide Rougon, who is going to be one of the characters in La Curée de Kill, where he describes the reconstruction of Paris, and he's a shady character who makes a fortune out of buying and selling these buildings. Dr. Pascal, and then you also get Rougon Macquart over here, the Bonheur des Dames. This is one of the people who will found the great department store, the Bon Marché, is described there. So these are the bourgeoisie who make it. Unfortunately, she also had a lover, as you do, who was a rather bad character. He was an alcoholic and he was violent. So on this side of the family, you see how he traces them differently. You have the heredity of madness, alcoholism and violence. And so he's going to trace this down, and these are all very interesting, but the ones that are the most interesting are this 4th generation here, which he situates in Paris. And here you have we have the Assommoir, here Gervaise Macquart, who ends up, struggles against her environment, but we'll talk about it in a moment. And her sons, children, all of whom will end up in dreadful ways. Anna will end up as a prostitute. What's this one here? Germinal, he actually ends up as a leader of a mining revolt. He ends up as a murderer, particularly murdering women. And Claude Lantier ends up as the mad artist, based on his oldest childhood memories of Cézanne. When it's published, he and Cézanne never speak to each other again. Now, this is L'Assommoir, which talks about the problems of the heredity of alcoholism and how this girl who starts out struggles, gets to one point, looks as though it's fine, marries a fellow who's another alcoholic, and in the end goes down and dies. So you get all of Zola's novels who sort of go to a peak and then descend again. And so it's this struggle, it's in many ways original sin has been changed into this hereditary destiny which is within you. You really can't get away with it. What Zola is actually trying to say, he's very critical of the Second Empire. And he's saying that people with these hereditary differences really are never going to survive in this vice-ridden city. So what I think is important is that he goes through the minutiae of observation, and the place that he actually, this is the Boulevard de la Chapelle, where are we? Rue de Clignancourt, and where's the Rue de la Goutte d'Or? This is where Gervaise lives, and just round here is actually the Assommoir, and you can still see the Place de l'Assommoir, and this street hasn't changed very much. So everything that he goes along and he actually describes in great detail. You know, it's no longer romanticism with the flights of passion, you know, in the depths of the Mississippi desert, you know. We're right there in Paris under the rubbish tins. Now, what he also describes here is this other problem of alcoholism. And what you have at this time, of course, is the rise of, well, drinking does become a great problem, but particularly the rise of the Green Fairy, which is absinthe, which is going to be considered responsible for many of the ills of society. In fact, it's going to be, you know, banned because of that. So absinthe actually has been around for a long time, but it comes into favour under the 1830 expansion by Louis Philippe into Algeria. And the troops go out, and as you do with troops, I think it happens with the First World War, they all went out with, you know, they had each had a load of whiskey bottles. I mean, you'd have to, wouldn't you, to be able to put a bayonet in and run over and kill people. I mean, so they use absinthe. And the idea is that it's actually it's medically, you know, all for medication because of dysentery. And when they come back as they're victorious, you know, our victorious generals come back from having conquered a few poor Arabs in Algeria, they sit and drink this drink on the boulevards at 5 o'clock. And of course there's this whole sort of, you know, paraphernalia with the absinthe glass and the ice, and you pour it over the spoon with sugar, and there's this wonderful ruching and this smell, and it becomes terribly popular. It's like a club. It's the green hour. You know, it's all got these different nicknames and so on. And it's marketed as healthy as well. It's supposed to be really good for you. And I mean, you really fall for these things. I can remember, I've got an Italian mother-in-law who told me that this drink called Ferrochino, which has got a lot of iron in it and it's good for children. Well, I mean, I used to give it to my kids a spoonful before they went off, and I only just found out last week it's actually a liqueur. I mean, they would have been, I mean, really, you know, oh, no, it's really good for them. You know, and I was swigging away, and I thought, gee, this makes me feel good, you know. But, so I'm not quite sure what that's got to do with it. But anyway, it's sort of marketed as a health elixir. And here you've got this is with photography, you know, with advertising, this rather fat fellow, and being fat at the time was good. You know, it meant that you weren't starving, or you didn't have tuberculosis. And of course there's this woman looking in thinking, oh, I'll have one of these. Absinthe, which is oxygenized. You see, it's got extra oxygen. And of course he's saying, look at this, you know, it's healthy. This is why I'm so fat and bald, all right? And However, it became obvious that what happens very briefly is that there is a phylloxera comes over from America with some of the vine roots and strikes at all of the vine crops. And wine becomes too expensive for the working classes, and they all start drinking absinthe and other manufactured drinks, because absinthe is made out of beet, at least the sugar from beet, and can be bought and is manufactured around Paris. And so it was cheaper, and it gave you a real kick, and it was also supposed to be hallucinogenic. I mean, it's got such a minute amount in it. Maybe if you drank bottles of it, it would be, but it was a very high alcohol content. I think it was 75% proof. Now, when you were actually drinking it on the inner boulevards with a little bit of water and everything, that's fine. But on the outer boulevards, they'd adulterated it with a bit of cognac. There was a bit of, in fact, they even had boot polish in it as well. So this really degenerates. And it's at this time that you get the temperance movement developing in the 1840s in England. And so the concept of alcoholism as a syndrome coincides in France with the rise of absinthe. And so absinthe is identified with alcoholism, right? You could drink bottles of wine, that didn't matter, because wine is the traditional drink of the French. You know, it's all about, you know, the outdoors, as we saw with the painting by Renoir. And so you get these posters. Someone's up on the tops of Paris, cri d'alarme, every glass of absinthe is a step towards madness, all right? And so this was this idea of alcoholism and madness, which was already being exploited in the novels. Bestsellers, by the way, absolute, people it was serialised in the newspapers. Everyone was, you know, trying to buy it, whereas now you sort of say read Zola and people think, oh, right. Every bottle of alcohol leads to ruin, the National League Against Alcoholism, which is in there. And now, rather than being the green fairy and being this intoxicating drink, you know, the bohemia and so on, it becomes the destroyer of the family. And so here you've got this working class woman upstairs with a red nose sort of saying, go on out, a bottle of absinthe and 1 penny's worth of bread. And of course they actually did have children drinking absinthe as well. Now, you now get this painting, which is done by Degas and exhibited in London. And of course the British immediately think this is exactly what they've always thought about the French. Degenerate, drunken, out there in the morning. And it is they who actually give the title of the absinthe drinkers. The original title was just In the Cafe, right? And this is Alain André, who we saw in that idyllic picnic at the boatman's lunch. Now, this then became a problem. Now, you now get madness, the working classes, they're drunks, but worse than that, women are starting to drink, right? And what happens? You've got this idea of you're no longer happy. People who drank wine were happy drunks. You know, you had a bit of a scuffle, a few red nose, you know, bloody nose and so on. Oh, didn't matter. But people who were absinthe drunks were more morose, evidently. I don't know. So here we have, what happens is you've got a woman out at dawn, and the idea now is, medically has been shown that people who are alcoholics produce smaller children, or these children are alcoholics themselves, and they turn into criminals as well, right? So this then is very much in line with the problems in French society are the fact that we have all these problems with the government, or dreadful conditions for the working class. It's all the fault of absinthe. And so absinthe will finally be banned in 1915. And you start getting these posters going up, you know, because you've got the Germans over the frontier. And look at them, for God's sake, you know, they're about a foot taller, they're a foot wider. In fact, the Germans could hardly see the French army. Oh, no, I've got something else to do. And they were producing more children as well. So this idea that the women now who are alcoholics and drinking absinthe are putting French society at risk, all right? It is now of national importance that people stop drinking. But alcoholism is linked then with absinthe. The people who actually owned the vines, of course, were the clergy and the aristocracy. You know, it was in their interest to get rid of absinthe because they then can start getting more revenue from their properties. So it's a real return to the ancien regime in many ways. Because absinthe is, of course, made in many ways by Jewish families. All right, and so you're going to, in fact, they even manufactured an anti-Jewish absinthe, sort of saying this is absinthe and it's not Jewish. It's really, so this is, all right, so here you have alcohol, there's the enemy, all right, but you notice that it's, the alcohol is absinthe, condemned to death, all right, this is a cry, who? The killer of intelligence, and that's all feminine, you notice, right? The corrupter of youth, the instigator of horrible things, she should be expelled. And the person says, I come to plead for the cause of a dead person. Absinthe, odious absinthe, don't drink it down with absinthe. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. It's revolutionary. The French at their best, you know, doing what they do best, which is revolutions. So that was drink, I suppose, which is exploited in Zola's novel L'Assommoir. But Gervaise, the person who is the main character there, has a daughter, Nana, who becomes one of the great courtesans or prostitutes of the time. And the other great question was the problem of prostitution. Now, no one really cared about whether they were prostitutes. By the end of the century, there were 34,000 women in brothels. She would not be in a brothel. She would be an independently kept woman. And she was based on Voltesse de la Bigne, who had managed to have her set up by wealthy men. I think she had 7 or 8 men who paid for her services at different times of the week. And in fact, she also had a salon with great artists, such as Gervaise was one of them, Manet, Courbet, and in fact she had so many lovers who were great artists, she was called the Union of Artists. Now, I want to just quickly look at, from a disease, I'm looking at this idea of women from a disease point of view. Now, as we know, women in the 19th century, leading on from those ideas of Rousseau, this idea of the domestic sphere and the public sphere. All right, that women do not go into the public sphere because why? Because they've developed these ideas. Science and medicine have now shown that women's brains are smaller. Now, I mean, we all suspected it, didn't we? But now it's proven women have smaller brains. Now, if you stimulate their brains with too much in the way of, you know, Latin or learning, blood will flow to the brain away from the uterus, and you'll end up with small children or none at all. So it's just going to be the same as with alcoholism. So women then become simply decorative objects in many ways, perhaps who will produce one child who will be an heir. But women here, I think this is a perfectly good example of how you were supposed to be if you were a middle-class bourgeois woman. You were an artificial creature in an artificial environment. This is a sort of a winter garden that they had in the 19th century where plants that were in winter summer plants could bloom in winter. In other words, technologies upturn nature. But she's also like that. She's corseted and her dress means that she can't move, all right? So she's an unnatural, artificial creature. And the more artificial you were, the better, because it meant that you were further away from nature, all right? Because nature was dirty. And this relates very much to social Darwinism, where you have the idea of the prostitute being at the bottom of the level of evolution. These prostitutes weren't made, they were born. They were kind of troglodyte characters, you can see by the low foreheads here, who have no sense of modesty as a normal woman would, right? Femininity meant modesty, it didn't mean sexuality. Femininity was related to maternal instincts, not to sexuality. Sexuality was something that men had and the troglodyte women here had. So most men, about 98% of men, went to brothels, and the other 2% were in the clergy. I won't go any further on that one. So, but this was all right. You therefore had these pure women who were given very little education, whose exteriors were a cipher of the success of their husband, right? So the self-made bourgeois husband exhibits this in particular through the virtue of his wife, and the more ill she was, the better, because that meant the less sexy she was and the closer she was to ethereal ideals, almost a bit like romantic. You get all this idea of the angel of the hearth. The poor dear angel, she just brushes the hearth with the tip of her wing and so on. Of course, she was maintained in this because she had a whole horde of little maids who ran round and who took care of the husband as well at night. All right? Anyway, but the real problem with prostitution at this time was this idea of syphilis. Right now, there was this syphilis had always been raging. However, it was particularly prevalent at the time. Remember, we looked at syphilis with Paganini. And medical science was showing this idea of heredity, which was terribly important, was showing that probably it was inherited. So, my goodness gracious, there's no question of stopping men going to brothels. Goodness, you can't upturn, natural society. So you have to check on prostitutes, right? And so this is a very sort of sympathetic view that you have of Toulouse-Lautrec, who lived for a while in the brothel at the Rue des Moulins, and who became quite friendly and actually got services probably for nothing with these paintings of the inmates who are lining up for their, I think about every couple of months they used to have, because you get the development of the speculum, right, used to have to be examined to see if they had venereal disease or not. Now, theoretically, this was supposed to stop the bourgeoisie being contaminated, and people weren't worried too much about their wives. What they worried about was, because it's hereditary, would their child be syphilitic, and therefore the whole kind of bourgeois dynasty would implode. So this is why this was important. However, during this time, you get, in the Second Empire, this self-actualizing middle class, these entrepreneurial men, a bit sick of the old sort of slap and tickle of the brothel, and because they're so entrepreneurial, they go out and seduce women from the streets, theoretically. But of course they are actually women. Now here you get Béraud. All around the Parc Monceau actually was an area where you get these women who were independent prostitutes. They didn't have pimps, they were independent, dressed as though they were respectable middle-class women. And it looks as though she's actually just going to cross a street, but you can see this guy over here who is in her sight line. And of course the idea was that he was supposed to approach her and she'd say, "Oh my goodness, not me, but I'm an honest woman, oh my, but you're so charming, I love your moustache." And so of course he'd think, "Oh goodness, I'm so irresistible," and off they'd trot. There was even a whole series of people who actually used to hang out in graveyards. There'd always be a woman, crying over a tomb at the cemetery, and of course the gallant mourners would say, "Madam, can I take you home?" "Oh, please do." And these were called the tomb raiders. But you got women who were, this was Cora Pearl, people who rose to the top, who would have been on the board of, BHP or something nowadays. They were very canny people, disliked men intensely. All of these great courtesans really disliked men, and most of them wrote their memoirs and had their account systems, but exploited men to the nth degree, were incredibly wealthy, throwing diamonds about, mansions in the centre of Paris, hundreds of horses and so on. Died young, but anyway, you can't have everything. Now, continuing on this idea of women and disease, this was the idea of the crinoline, and I just wanted to give you a glimpse of this ridiculous nature of the middle-class woman. All right, this was not for the little working-class girls who were looking after Madame. Notice that they're in a completely different outfit. And basically what it does is isolates the bourgeois woman. She is literally an untouchable. All right, if you try and take the woman's hand and you're standing on the outskirts of that crinoline, it's all virtually impossible. What happens at this time with the big shops, you now get fashion magazines showing the crinoline. And what happens with fashion magazines is you get this idea of externals being very important, and a commodification of looks and gestures. Right? You can read a magazine and work out how to behave, right? And you also start getting manuals of etiquette. It was very easy to learn to conform. So the bourgeois self must conform to this public vision. This is what it looked like, but this underneath a cage, and I really want to use these words because they were called a cage, and that's virtually what it was like. Women were encaged, and underneath their underwear was also a kind of an allegory of their life, all right? They were straight-laced, all right? And this goes over into the moral ideas of being an upright woman. You were pulled upright. You were laced within an inch of your life. I mean, this is why women fainted. They had fainting rooms. Well, of course, because you couldn't breathe, and of course also women developed tuberculosis as well. I just wanted to quickly go into this. Up until the end of the 19th century, you don't have underpants, all right? Underpants because, of course, you have drawers that go over each leg but aren't joined in the middle, because it was impossible to do anything. I mean, go to a toilet with a crinoline, all right? And so people just sort of put a kind of a pot underneath. Sorry to go into the great details, but it's only later, very much later, when you get the development of sport and this interest in women actually doing something. Women actually did waste away from lack of energy. They ate very little meat. They lived in incredibly dusty environments and actually suffered from what they call green disease, which was actually a kind of an anemia, I think, that people had. Anyway, you get the development of the bicycle at the end of the 19th century, which frees women. There's the New Age woman, but she's still got a corset on, as you will see. However, you can't sit on a bicycle seat without undies. And so you get one of the things that's going to propel underwear to actually be closed is going to be the development of the bicycle. Now, the gynecologists came out in force against bicycles. What were women doing? My goodness. You know, pleasuring themselves, sitting on bicycle seats. They also had it in for sewing machines because you sort of moved your legs up and down and rubbed your thighs. Oh, not good either. So these were very controversial things. Not only meant that women got out and about, but they were changing the way in which they dressed under their clothes. And I just wanted to quickly finish off with this idea. Women are starting by the second half of the 19th century to actually make demands because women were politically, socially minors, right? They went from the tutor or the power of their husband into the power of the father into the power of the husband. They couldn't vote. If they were caught having an affair, they would be divorced and they would have nothing to live on. It was a very precarious life. However, so women are starting to ask for rights, goodness knows, not the vote, but maybe education. And so medical science takes over and puts women into a different infantilized category. And so it is all of these illnesses that you're going to get which become feminine. Right, kleptomania in particular. Now, up until Géricault had shown that portrait of a male kleptomaniac. But now it becomes female because there were of the shops, the grand magasin, where you could actually pick things up, and here you have a woman putting things under her petticoat. Now, female kleptomaniacs were not charged by law because it was considered that they couldn't help it, right? And was tied to biology, particularly pregnant women or women at certain times of their cycle. Women are just like that. You can't actually charge them with criminal offences. They're so weak and pathetic anyhow. So they would be charged. Maybe they'd have a good behaviour bond and so on. And then, of course, you get this interest in hysteria, this sort of voyeuristic idea of the female emotions that we looked at in detail with Dr. Charcot. And I just want to mention that at the French Film Festival, which is on at the moment, there is a film called Augustine. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. And Augustine was the name of Charcot's favourite hysterical woman who used to come out and exhibit and go through the stages like an actress, and on whom Sarah Bernhardt will model her characters of Phaedra and the great tragic heroines. So if you can see it, it's Augustine. I'd actually wanted to do a documentary, I should have. Now, you also very, very quickly, this idea of hygiene also develops into leisure time. Now, the bourgeoisie want leisure, right, because the aristocrats had it. So therefore, the bourgeoisie want the same kinds of things, and the aristocrats the English aristocrats had discovered around Nice and had been coming there in winter to get away from English winter for years, and the French finally discover it when in 1860 Nice is given over to the French, right? Napoleon III gets it given to him by the Italians. And so the idea of going to the waters now becomes going to light, heat and light and pure air becomes important. And in the 1860s and by 1900, of course, you get the train line, which has already been built, but you get this wonderful blue train at the Gare de Lyon with the stations here. Now, I need to go on to the Commune. The 1848 Napoleon III is persuaded in many ways by his wife, who's a great Catholic, and others, to indulge in a war against Prussia, which the French think they will win within a twinkling of an eye, that they'll be eating sauerkraut in Berlin very quickly. In actual fact, it's a rout. The French army is very, very undermanned and disorganised. It's probably all the fault of Absinthe. And they are very quickly routed. The Napoleon III goes off into exile, back to where he came from, London, and a provisional government takes over in Paris. Now, the people who are voted into the provisional government often have monarchical tendencies, all right? So, you've got a government, a republican government, which is now declared the end of the Second Empire. He's gone. The French declare a republic, the Third Republic, vote in people, some of whom will be monarchical, in other words, either Bourbon, legitimists, or from the Orleans. And so the people of Paris already are worried about them. The Prussians besiege Paris. Paris will not give in. And for 5 months, the Prussians bombard the city of Paris. Now, to begin with, you've got this idea here of people, students giving these men, people giving the students ploughs to go out and fight, defend the city of Paris. By the way, Manet will be there doing his job, as will Degas. Renoir, of course, has managed to go to the south and be looked after by someone else. Bazille will die, whereas Monet and Pissarro have hot-footed it off to England. Now, during this time, the Parisians undergo appalling deprivation. There is no food at all. It's one of the coldest winters possible. And what you have here is this almanac of the besieged, and here you have a cook about to chop up rats. Now, they went through all of the animals, then they went through all of the horses, the cavalry horses, then they finally got down to rats and sparrows, and finally, on Christmas Day, the people who could afford it on the 99th day of the siege, they were eating roast camel, kangaroo stew, and bear ribs. What had happened, of course, was that the zoo animals were being slaughtered. All right, and so they went down these photos of them shooting the elephants, and here you have chevreuil, antelope, wolf, cat done with rats, salad of croissant, and you also get, I thought there's no elephant there, is there? Oh, well, anyhow, they did. It was supposed to be rather oily, but didn't. So they were really down to the last. So the people of Paris had actually survived this. Now, the provisional government, right, decides to sign a treaty with the Prussians. And the Prussians demand that France give them Alsace and Lorraine. They demand that they be allowed victory marches through Paris, hundreds of thousands and thousands of francs in return as well. And the French, the Parisians, rise up against this, whereas the government, their Second Republic government, sign it. The government realises that there's going to be dreadful problems, and this is their own government, the Versailles Second Republic government, has problems, in other words, where it is with the Parisians. And in Paris, there are something like 400 cannons. And the National Guard, all right, who are the sort of militiamen, they're like the Dad's army who've been, defending Paris against the siege, take these cannon up to Montmartre. The government is worried about this because they think they might actually start bombarding them, the government, and send in troops to take these cannons from Montmartre. And here we have the moment when women get up on the barricades and come between the troops of the Second Republic and the people holding onto the cannons and stop them. And you will notice the way in which this is sketched. Again, the liberty leading the people. And here you have the army of the French Republic fraternising with the crowd, dropping their arms and joining this uprising. Now, the uprising had happened because this Republican government, not only were they going to sign this humiliating treaty with the Prussians, but also they said, you have to now pay, well, during the siege, all rent, but no one had collected the rent. They now wanted the poor to have to pay the rent, backdated. The poor had also given up all their tools to the pawn shops to get money to buy food, and of course no one could work. And so the government wanted them to actually pay to get their tools back. And also, what else was there? There were a whole lot of things like this. And so the National Guard of Paris rise up and start forming militia in the different arrondissements. And this is very important because you've got parts of Paris which are quite bourgeois and are horrified by what's going on in the working class parts. The government, under Thiers, sees what's happening and hot-foots it out to Versailles. So now you've got this Monty Python situation with the Prussians sort of sitting outside Paris, watching the Versailles Republican government trying to bombard its own capital, Paris, which is now taken over by the Commune. And it's called the Commune. And this is one of these great experiments. It only lasts it was declared on the 28th of March, and it goes, I think, to the 13th of May. It's a I think it's about 66 days, very short. But it's one of these times when the left wing takes over, and for once the anarchists and the Marxists and the Proudhonists and the Blanquists, all of the different shades of red, managed to work together and to set up a kind of communal-based government. And it works. What happens is, here you've got from one of the newspapers, you have bourgeois women working in factories here with women, working class women. So they now it was actually very well organised. Food was now not plentiful, but it was being manufactured. All sorts of things were brought into power. Women particularly now came out and demanded that they have schools. The first women's school was set up. You have orphanages set up. You have free soup kitchens set up. It's actually quite amazing what they managed to achieve in a very short time. Everyone was going to have the vote. Now, what actually happens at the time of the Commune is that you have this desire to eliminate all of the ideas of tyranny. And there were a huge number of refugees in Paris who were communist refugees who'd come from other parts of Europe during the times of the Revolution of 1848. Remember that there are revolutions in Italy, in Poland and Russia, and you get all of these people who are there. And so the Communards, now with the idea of the international idea of freedom, pull down the column of Vendôme column, which has the statue of Napoleon on it, because Napoleon was supposed to have been the person who oppressed, he didn't at all, but anyway, oppressed other nationalities. In fact, he actually freed them from servitude. So you get this rather naive picture of the National Guard, all right, who by now didn't have an awful lot to eat, but were drinking copious amounts of absinthe because it could be manufactured on the spot. And here you have them sort of posing around here at the base before the statue is going to be pulled down. Now, this is a very interesting photograph because you notice the way in which it looks as though you're in the sea. In actual fact, you're in the middle of the Place Vendôme, but you can see the way the people around that have been sort of blurred out. Mm-hmm. This was because once the Commune was defeated, they took the photos and they identified who had done it. Mm-hmm. And so some of these they managed to obliterate the faces, but these poor guys, they could pick out who they were and they would be taken out and executed. Now what happens is that someone opens the gate. You know, it's one of these stories that you get from ancient Rome all the way through. Sees up around Courbevoie one of the gates of the walls unattended and lets the Versailles troops in. Now the Prussians very cleverly had been managing to release prisoners of war, French prisoners of war, so they've joined the Republican troops besieging Paris. And so they come in, and what happens is that the Communards could have really held out tremendously longer if they'd actually taken over the bank. They could have got all of the funds from the Bank of France and paid for armies to come in, but they didn't. And also they had great loyalty according to which arrondissement they came from. So the working class arrondissement, which is always to the north and particularly over here, were much better organised and were ferocious fighters, as opposed to here, which is where you actually get the troops, the Republican troops. Ridiculous, isn't it, being let in? Republican troops led by monarchists, by the way. And this is one of the reasons why the Parisians were desperate to get rid of the government, because they thought they'd get a king. All right, so this is where they come in. So this is where the first to fall, the next to fall, the next, and this is where they hold out to the end. So here they are, they actually barricade the streets with their homemade barricades. Now the whole reason that Napoleon III had restructured Paris was to get rid of the barricades. In actual fact, the Versailles street fighters were savvy men, and they tunnelled through the walls of houses and got round the barricades. The irony was that the only place where they couldn't do that was where Haussmann's boulevards were so wide that the houses weren't there. So gradually these they will fight barricade to barricade. And later on, it is seen that it's the women who are on the barricades inciting men, and they're known as the pétroleuses, the petrol throwers. It's always the fault of women. Even if it's Absinthe, it's their fault. The fact that the army wasn't big enough, their fault. Women constantly, I don't want to harp on this too much, and probably I am, but it is, there's this victimisation of one gender. So here she looks masculine, you see. She's got breasts, but she's got a moustache, and she's putting on petrol. And it is these women who are supposed to have burnt Paris. You did actually have people who were quite extraordinary. This is Louise Michel, who was known as the Red Virgin. She was a school teacher, believed in teaching ideals, and she was caught and miraculously wasn't court-martialed and executed, but sent out to New Caledonia. I just need to say that in 1888, people who were sent into New Caledonia were all pardoned and brought back. There was one person, I actually did a Radio National broadcast a couple of months ago on a man called Lucien Henry, who was a communard who came out here and ended up working at the institute in Sydney, technical schools in Sydney. Anyhow, so she is one of these pétroleuses. Now, Luce, who we'll talk about in a minute, you get very few paintings of the dead bodies. You get Luce, who is an anarchist, and Manet, of all people, he does a lithograph of the dead in the streets. Do we see Renoir? No. Are we going to? No, not a glimpse of this. As the Communards go suburb by suburb, they set fire to Paris. So, in other words, what do they set fire to? Those institutions that they had been exiled from at the time of the 1848 revolution, when Napoleon III had come to power. So it's a kind of revenge. It's the working classes coming back down from Montmartre, down from Belleville to the centre and burning it. And Paris burns. They were going to systematically raze everything. They only just stopped Notre Dame being dynamited, the Louvre, the basements were already burning, the Tuileries Palace, the Palais des Contes, all of the Paris was set on fire. Finally, the last of the Communards, the most ferocious fighting takes place in the homeland of Red Paris. It still is. It's the north east, round Père Lachaise Cemetery. Here you see them fighting up on Père Lachaise amongst the tombs. And in fact, still today, it is a revered part of Paris, this wall where they put their hands up and they were fired against, au mort de la Commune, to the dead of the Commune, 21st to the 28th of May. And during the bloody week, La Semaine Sanglante, They think between 20 to 30,000 people died in the fighting, which is more than the French Revolution, and then something like 20,000 or 30,000 were executed afterwards or sent into exile. Now, here you have what is really, I think, fascinating with the development of photography is that you thought you could see and believe, but now seeing is not believing at all. What the triumphant Republican government does after it's massacred anyone who looked as though they could carry a gun, they recreated the great moments of the martyrs. So here you have priests and some of the people in the government who had been shot by the Commune. So what you have here is a recreation by the victorious side. They actually got photographs of the heads of the people and stuck them on characters. So it looks like, and they published them in the newspapers. So it's a very powerful propaganda thing of this idea of the dangerous, beastly working class. Well, do we see any of this in Renoir's paintings? Not a sausage. All right, here we have Bal, Moulin de la Galette, just down from Montmartre, where this execution took place. Again, it's a staged execution. They've rounded up some people. This isn't an action shot at all, but we're just behind Saint-Pierre de Montmartre, a couple of feet away. You'll notice the date 5 years later. No, we don't see any of it. What about the Tuileries Garden by Pizarro? And this is even more curious because Pizarro is a convinced anarchist. I'm going to go 5 minutes over. Is that all right? Here we have the Tuileries Gardens, which is just here. If you actually look here, and he actually painted another 2 feet, he would be painting the burnt-out Tuileries Palace. All right? So he's deliberate, and which was still standing. All right? This is what it looked like. So he has deliberately chosen a part where you cannot see the ravages of Paris. And in fact, all of the paintings of the Impressionist time are painted with these hulks, burnt out hulks studying Paris. You can't get round it. Here you have a wonderful day in the Parc Monceau, and just up the road, like 100 yards, was where you'd had one of the last barricades across the street. Well, here we have them back again, this idea of the bucolic day. This is 1881. The French president will be shot at about a few years later. But what's also important and is interesting is that even with 1871, with a republic now, the Third Republic coming into power, and which will stay in power up until the Second World War, there is this feeling that they have never actually got the ideals of the French Revolution working. And so, even after 1871, during this time when you're getting these wonderful paintings of the Impressionists of a wonderful summer day, there is a strong anarchical movement. And those of you who have been to see Radiance at the NGV gallery will have seen painters such as Luce, Signac, all of who were convinced anarchists and who painted this idea of an ideal society. Now, Pissarro, right, the great Pissarro, actually was the person who did the etchings for a socialist review called Turpitude Sociale, low social horrors. And of course, over here he's sitting up on Montmartre. This is Father Time, looking down over industrial Paris. Can you see this idea of the city as hell? That was what people were trying to escape when they went to the Côte d'Azur. Hell, and the chimneys are in line with the Eiffel Tower. So this idea of capitalism and the chimneys, this idea of, socialism as the death of society. And around it you've got the sun of anarchy. Now anarchy for us means violence, it means assassinations, whereas at the time anarchy meant not a rule, not a centralised rule. And what the peaceful anarchists anyhow were trying to establish was a kind of idyllic state which is decentralised, where individual freedom is guaranteed by the communal society, and where you get an idealised relationship between money and labour. In fact, you know, you get an exchange of goods. You don't even need to have a money system. And it will all take place more or less in the countryside. And this is one of the things that Pissarro believed when he was out painting in Pontoise and further around, this idea that eventually man will go back to a kind of idealised society. And so in 1895, you have Luce. Now, Luce was the person who did that painting of the dead bodies of the Commune. He feels that, again, unfinished business. And he goes to paint. There have been, anarchists have become what we know anarchists to be today. Bombs have been planted, and in fact, in the previous year to this painting, Sadi Carnot, the French Prime Minister, have been assassinated by an anarchist. But this doesn't worry Luce, who's living now away from the city of vice, the city of the capitalists, and he's living in this kind of utopian golden age where you have the beautiful sort of sunlight of the Mediterranean, where you have groups of men working at manual tasks. So you've still got this division between men and women, which I always think is quite interesting. Women here are relaxing and playing and doing a bit of cooking, doing your hair, getting naked, you know, as you do, you know. I mean, how boring, but anyway, but men are doing the work. And this idea of this pure life in nature. And I just want to read what Luce Cross actually wrote to Signac and said, "Until now, the pictures dealing with the theme of anarchy have always depicted revolt, either directly or indirectly, through scenes of poignant misery. Let us imagine instead the dreamed of age of happiness and well-being, and let us show the actions of men, their play and their work in this era of general harmony." And Cross tells Signac, "I want to paint the happiness and the lucky citizens of some century hence, when pure anarchy has been achieved." So this image of the Golden Age then is very much in line with that image I started out with Renoir's idea of a Golden Age, albeit he's at least in the city. But it also, he's now painting this about 140 years after Rousseau has published Émile, and this idea of returning to man, of being in chains when he's in society, he's born free, is by returning to nature and to a pre-urban society that man is going to achieve his true being. It's very interesting that now in France, of course, we have the Fifth Republic, but we've now elected a socialist government. And the same problem, of course, arises of this idea of the revolution. And François Hollande is a committed socialist who is determined to push through a socialist agenda, even though it will drive France, I mean, this is my opinion, but I think it's carried out by other people, into dire circumstances. This idea of equality of work, the dignity of work, even when it's in factories that actually have to be artificially maintained. So the problem then of individual liberty, and it's the problem now, is who pays for it? Who pays to maintain your individual liberty, where now all people have the vote, and God knows even women have the vote, but we all have the right to happiness, but should some people pay for it? And at the moment, those who are bourgeois and who have strived and achieved, those who earn over €1 million a year, now have their money taxed at 75%, and so there is this exile of the wealthy bourgeois to other countries. The best known to you would be Gérard Depardieu. Not sure that he's a loss, but also the managing director of Louis Vuitton and so on. And the big question now, and I think this is the important one, is the French are now considering these people who have escaped and gone out of France because of the tax system, should they be considered to be French? I think that's very interesting. Well, thank you very much for your attention.